Hello and welcome to Grow Conversations, your window into the world of medical cannabis here in the United Kingdom. My name's Alex Fraser, I'm your host, and on today's episode we have Jon Robson, Managing Director of MAMEDICA. Welcome, Jon.
Thank you.
So it's great to be here, and I should say thank you for having us.
No, thank you for coming.
This lovely environment that you've got here in your office. So, I mean, where are we? That's a good starting point.
So we are actually in the consulting rooms of the Lister Hospital. So ordinarily the Lister Hospital is based on Chelsea Bridge Road.
Yep.
And within this building, we have a number of consultants and practices which see out patients essentially, which come from that hospital.
Brilliant. So before we get into the nitty gritty of, we want to learn a little bit more about you and your background and what you're up to here in medical cannabis. But I think it'd be good to understand a bit more about MAMEDICA. So I know you guys do a lot of different things, clinic, pharmacy. There's a lot going on. So give us a little intro into MAMEDICA, if you would.
So in a snapshot, MAMEDICA is a private medical cannabis clinic regulated by the Care Quality Commission. And we also have our own linked pharmacy, which handles dispensing of the medication we prescribe, which is regulated by the General Pharmaceutical Council. So at this point in time, we just prescribe and dispense medical cannabis to patients in the UK. Sure.
And when were you guys launched?
So we launched in June last year, June 2022. So we've been prescribing for 10 months now.
Great.
MAMEDICA was actually probably conceptualized back in 2021. We launched or incorporated the company, not launched, in August 2021.
Sure.
And it took us the best part of sort of 8 months to get the personnel, the premises, all the paperwork that we needed to have in place to effectively make the applications to the relevant regulators to obtain the licenses that we need to do what we do. And we obtained both licenses probably coincidentally in April last year, a couple of months before we launched.
Great. So pretty much coming up to a year since you got the licenses, 10 months since you've been prescribing to patients, and I guess we'll come back and talk to the personnel and a few of the other bits and pieces a little later on. But let's get a little background on yourself, if that's all right. So what were you doing before you were involved in cannabis?
Sure. So in a previous life, I actually spent 18 years in financial markets. So I started as a 16-year-old in 2003.
Wow, that's young.
As a little bit, as a runner probably, as you would call it now and probably then. That was in foreign exchange. So I started off in foreign exchange sales, became a foreign exchange trader, which was my profession for the first 9 years of being in financial markets. And then for the last 9 years, I was actually an equity derivatives trader. So I used to specialize in Swiss equities.
Okay.
So the big ones were actually pharmaceuticals. So Novartis, Roche,
Interesting.
And Nestle was the other big one. And that was kind of my forte. So that's what I did in a previous life. I'd always had a natural interest in cannabis, and in the back of my mind, I'd always wanted to provide the service that we do now when the framework became available. And that kind of stemmed back from, clearly as teenagers, we probably all had a little bit of exposure to cannabis, but it wasn't until I spent time on the West Coast in California, West Coast of America. It wasn't until I actually stepped foot into a licensed dispensary. This was around sort of 2015. It was actually quite hard to get in one of these dispensaries before then, if you didn't genuinely have a card, as it were, which would slightly different to what happens here. In America, you get issued with a card by the doctor, which permits you to then go into a dispensary to go and pick and choose or to trial which medications potentially could help the condition. And upon entering this facility, as it were, it really dawned on me that it wasn't recreational users in this retail unit, as it were, but it was certainly an older demographic. I seem to recall a couple of them, with Zimmer frames and apparatus like that to help them kind of have better mobility.
It's not what you expect, is
Absolutely.
it? Absolutely. And it's interesting because I think we had a similar thing when we were campaigning before the law change here in the UK, where I think there was an assumption, particularly perhaps with the older generation, that medical cannabis was a sort of way to proliferate legalization and just sort of recreational use, and it was sort of a medical use excuse was being used to move that forward. And I guess for you the scales fell from your eyes a little bit seeing that firsthand.
Yeah, absolutely. I have to say, most probably before I entered that dispensary, I also had that same opinion. I probably was slightly skeptical about whether or not cannabis could actually produce, could relieve symptoms of chronic conditions. But that was certainly when the penny first dropped, that this could be something considerably more beneficial than just allowing recreational users to come and access a legal pathway. And that is when kind of I started first thinking about, potentially being able to offer this service when we were permitted to. But it wasn't until May 2021, so almost coming up to 2 years ago now, that I reconnected with an old work colleague that I worked with in finance sort of 10 years earlier. He was actually probably one of the founders of the business that I worked with. And he alluded to the fact that he had just been prescribed medical cannabis by one of our competitors for anxiety and depression brought on by pressures on his business which were caused by COVID. And we got chatting, and it became apparent that the service and probably the products that he was receiving weren't of a particularly good standard or quality. And it was round about then that I immediately got to work. I mean, I think that pretty much was my last day in finance in May 2021 when I found out that there were 10,000 patients. And the things
weren't perfect.
Weren't perfect,
there was work to be done.
Exactly. As with any nascent industry like this, things are never going to be perfect. I think as we've talked about sort of in previous conversations, we fully respect all of the clinics and pharmacies that have trod the path before us, because without them we wouldn't be able to offer the same experience that we are able to offer our patients, because it was a whole lot harder 3-4 years ago to be able to actually write and fulfill these prescriptions.
Absolutely. And that's something, I talk to colleagues who've worked in pharmaceuticals for a long time. That's not even unique to cannabis, that there's a teething period before drugs are more widely accepted and people understand them in terms of how to prescribe, and doctors understand them better. So I think, and it's interesting that it was something I was going to bring up, is this sort of how I perceive MAMEDICA, having worked in this space since the very start, almost as round two of the clinics, and we had a sort of about somewhere between 5 and 10, I think, in the first couple of years. Now we have somewhere near 20, possibly more. But there's a new wave of clinics, I think, that was launched in particularly the last 12 months, and you can see the granular level at which you're perfecting your services and perfecting that patient care, and just seeing that improvement, I think, in real time is really encouraging. So so props and great work, and it's good to have you guys in the scene.
I appreciate you saying that. Certainly, as you've probably experienced as well, there have been some difficulties, probably less so since we started in June compared to the previous 4 years that predated us, clearly. But
teething issues might be underplaying a little bit, and I think if anyone's watching, I know there'll be patients watching who will be like, it's not been amazing for those first few years, and I think we have to, as an industry, we have to sort of hold our hands up and say, it's taken us a while to get to a place where, and there's still ways to go. There's still improvements that can be made. Yeah,
absolutely. I think there's always going to be issues, but it's about how you deal with them, and ultimately, we really have. As you mentioned the term granular. We really have thought about, at a granular level, how can we make this the best possible experience for the patient, albeit with the bottlenecks which could occur. And I think one of the main things that our patients have kind of reported back to us is that if there is a problem, we're very keen to get it sorted as quickly as possible and with minimum fuss. And I think there have possibly been instances where some of these patients have been at clinics who, have greater patient numbers than us, maybe haven't had the time to be able to look at it as closely as we have, and are therefore having the experiences that they've had. And I think the bit that's quite touching for us is when we start to see reviews, and clearly we're not involved in these forums whatsoever, so it's very it's rewarding when we see some of these reviews which are actually quite in-depth about how we're trying to help people, because actually we genuinely are. And
seeing the fruit of your labour.
Absolutely,
right?
It's good to see people they're getting the experience which we're intending them to have.
It's working. And that's I mean, that's lovely to hear as well. I mean, it must be very reassuring, considering where you were this time last year, not one prescription written at that point, to be here and to be getting that positive feedback from patients directly.
Absolutely. It's one thing saying we're going to go and do this and we're going to provide this high level service and everyone's going to have a great experience, and preparing for delivering an operation like this is very different to actually doing it in real life. And I'll be completely honest, we had to learn on the job. We saw at 1 month when they had to come in for their follow-ups, that's a bottleneck. We saw at 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, whatever the case may be. As we're getting there, at every step of the process, we've had to make adjustments and improve, because, like I said, the preparation for performing the real life job is very different to actually doing it.
Dress rehearsal is a different thing. You don't have that audience there, and I suppose in this case the audience is those patients who are relying on you for that healthcare, and great to hear that that is working out. I want to take it back just a little bit, just because throughout us talking, I've noticed certain dates and timings of things, and I wondered if I just had the thought. I wondered if COVID played a role in your transition from finance into cannabis. Was it completely coincidental that it happened around that time?
To be honest with you, I wouldn't say so. As I said, I've been doing this since I was 16 years old, and I was working in finance. That's wrong use of English language. I had been working in financial markets since I was 16 years old, and I'd always known that by the time I kind of got to 35 years old, my shelf life as a trader, broker, dealer, whatever you want to call it, would be starting to come to its endpoint. Not for a number of reasons, actually. Clearly there would be a younger, more hungry version of me out there without a wife, without a kid, possibly a second kid on the way, who could go out every night entertaining customers till the sun rises, and I was always looking for something to transition my skills that I'd picked up during my time in the markets. And like I said to you, this had always been in the back of my mind. And in actual fact, roughly around the time that the legislation changed in November 2018, I was contacting a company out in Portland, Oregon called Cura Partners, which at the time had the market-leading THC vape being retailed or distributed amongst legitimate dispensaries. And having spent some time in California, I'd become aware of this brand. And when I got back to the UK, I started thinking, and basically the idea that I came up with was that we would see whether or not, via contacts that I had, we could get the vape in front of the NHS to see whether or not this could be something that they could do some research on whether or not this could be an alternative to whatever else they're prescribing. And so I cold called this company, Cura Partners, flew out there probably a couple of times. They were very interested in what we were talking about, and probably late 2018, early 2019, I actually signed a deal with this company to become their European distributor of their CBD products. We found out very early on there was no pathway to get this THC vape in front of the NHS. There was no interest whatsoever. And I found out that they also had the market-leading CBD brand. At the time, they were in 20,000 doors in the US, which is quite significant. The legislation, Farm Bill, had actually just changed there as well, which made it a more relevant market, as it were. But beforehand, it was a little bit grey. And in actual fact, that didn't go anywhere because roughly about 2 to 3 months into that relationship, Curaleaf, which obviously owns Sapphire and now CBPM Access, which was their pharmacy, and now it's called Curaleaf Pharmacy, bought out Cura Partners for 1.2 billion.
I was going to ask if there was a link with the Curaleaf.
There is now.
There is now.
Yeah,
sure.
there is now. So Curaleaf bought their THC arm for $1.2 billion and just disbanded their CBD arm, just had absolutely no interest in it whatsoever. So we had talks, and they'd flown over to the UK to discuss us manufacturing the product here, because at the time you weren't allowed to manufacture ingestible products using isolate CBD.
Sure.
And that's what they were using out there. So we were bringing them over to discuss using broad spectrum and bringing them to facilities, and the talks were ongoing to do this. And then obviously takeover happened, which threw a spanner in the works, and nothing came to fruition in the end. We did import some disposable vape cartridges, but that was kind of me dipping my toe in the water with regards to eventually getting to the point where we're at now.
Sure.
So I would say probably I've been seriously thinking about this for probably 8 years now. Not seriously thinking about it for probably the best part of 20 years.
Sure.
So
it's always been there in the back of your mind.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean,
it's interesting to hear about the whole CBD, that project that obviously sadly didn't come to anything. But I mean, it sounds complicated just from what you're explaining now, and that's just to clarify for the audience, that's just a CBD brand from the US to the UK, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And the level of complexity and buyouts and deals that can make these things fall flat. And it brings me on to what I was going to say earlier when you're talking about bottlenecks, which is, as an industry, and particularly with yourselves as a clinic, you sort of sit in that middle place between, you've got the patient on one side, obviously you're dedicated to looking after and responsible for looking after, and then on the other side you've got the regulators, you've got government departments, you've got producers. There's a huge network and web of regulations and ticks and boxes that you have to check, and that sitting between those two things must be really difficult. Yeah,
absolutely. Look, I come from a regulated industry anyhow.
True.
So, and the level of scrutiny in financial markets clearly increased over the period that I was working, for many different reasons. But the Madoffs, the FTXs, there's untold examples of why there should be heavy regulation in financial markets, even up until this day. A few weeks ago, Credit Suisse, one of the pillars of global financial markets, was actually my biggest customer that I've ever had, Credit Suisse, and was forced into a bailout or takeover as such at a heavily discounted rate. I mean, it just would have, even something like that would have been unthinkable, even as little as 6 months ago. So coming into another regulated industry, clearly there are hoops that we need to jump through, and for very valid reasons, because we're dealing with people's lives here. We're dealing with their health, and I think that we need to adhere to the highest standards, and we have a duty of care to our patients. So I'm not averse to regulation. I encourage it, but ultimately it doesn't get away from our primary objective, which is getting the highest quality medication in the hands of the patient, irrespective of who manufactures it and irrespective of how much we make on it. And I think that if that is our ethos, then there shouldn't really be a regulator who could take aim at us to say that we had an ulterior motive, because that genuinely is what we're doing right now.
Stay true to the course, right?
Absolutely.
It almost sounds like you've worked in finance. This is you're quite happy over here in the cannabis space now, because it sounds less complicated.
Look, finance.
If there's anywhere there might be more complicated.
I obviously didn't deal with that. I was just one of the guys who was just shouting numbers down a phone.
Sure.
As you can imagine, when the compliance officer walked by, it was a running joke that we used to all put the phones down and start whispering. But look, it's a different beast for sure. When you're dealing with finance, you make a mistake, you write the wrong thing on a confirmation, you maybe don't send the confirmation to the customer, maybe the currency doesn't get to the right place on the correct value date, but ultimately it's not going to affect
No one's going to be in pain.
No one's going to be in pain. No one's going to be anxious. No one's going to be stressed. No one's going to go without medication and possibly have some other reaction or repercussion. Exactly. So I think it's a different type of regulation.
And a different type of pressure for you personally, I suppose, and those you work with.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when you work in finance, most circumstances, most days when you go home at night and you go back to your family, your kids, whatever, girlfriend, wife, whatever the case may be, you really haven't got to worry about much because you fulfilled your responsibility, you've completed your task for the day,
you've clocked off,
and then you're kind of able to switch off. But when you're trying to operate a clinic and a pharmacy, and you're trying to ensure that the doctors, the patient support staff, the GPs, the pharmacists, the dispensers are all happy, doing their jobs correctly, all the processes are being followed to enable us to then ensure that the patients are getting the medication on time, they're being booked in for their follow-ups, they're being constantly checked up on to make sure that the medication is providing relief and the service is up to the standard they're expecting. There are just many, and then we haven't even talked about marketing, getting patients to sign up, awareness, education. There's just many different moving pieces.
Spinning plates.
Absolutely, spinning plates, absolutely. There's many plates that need to be spun to make sure that the wheels of this operation continue to move smoothly, as it were.
Yeah, and let's talk about awareness in just a little bit. But before we do, I think you mentioned doctors. Let's talk about doctors. How do you go about finding doctors to work in this space?
So when we first started, clearly we were looking for doctors who had already prescribed in the UK at another clinic or potentially independently. So I'm talking specifically cannabis-based prescription medicines.
People with experience. It is a niche space, isn't
absolutely.
it?
Clearly you can have 10, 15, 20 years working for NHS, consultant psychiatrists, consultant pain specialists, but without having prescribed medical cannabis before and having received feedback from patients who have used medical cannabis versus traditional medications, I think it's quite difficult to hit the ground running.
Yeah.
So as such, initially when I went out and looked for doctors, we were looking solely for doctors that prescribed before. Clearly that were able to communicate very well. By virtue of the fact that they're doctors, you have to assume that they're all caring and they're in it for the right reasons anyhow, because my brother's actually a second-year doctor and you have to go through a number of years of quite intense, underpaid work before you could even get anywhere close to becoming a doctor listed on the specialist register. So initially we found some doctors who were at some clinics who we compete with, who maybe weren't getting the same perks that we were basically offering them. So coming from a financial services background, I tried to instill a scheme or a mechanism by which doctors could be remunerated, whereby they felt a greater sense of ownership or inclusion in our journey.
Sure.
So as well as getting the fees that they get for performing the services that they do, i.e. the virtual consultations, we are implementing a scheme at MAMEDICA where we will pay out a percentage of our profits when we make them. We're not there yet, I can assure you.
Sure.
Please God, one day when we are actually making money, we will pay out a percentage of our profits to our staff, just like a financial services brokerage or bank would as a bonus, and potentially for the right individuals they could also earn options in the group, for instance. So that was something which was a little bit different to what some of the clinics that had
I was going to say I've not heard of other clinics using a similar model and providing value in that form to doctors.
What I would say is that I
sense.
worked at two companies that sold out in the hundreds of millions, and although I was getting paid very nice bonuses for bringing in revenue and profit for the department that I worked within, I would have loved to have even just 0.25%, 0.5%. I probably would have worked a whole lot harder, but when you're young, you don't necessarily think about what might come were there to be an exit for the company that you work for. You just want as high a salary as you could possibly negotiate and as much bonus as you can get. And probably we pay our doctors a slightly lower headline rate than they would probably get for a consultation outside of medical cannabis. But clearly this is a pool of doctors who are open to looking at different treatment methods for their patients, and clearly I think that they should be not incentivized, but they should empowered, but also for being some of the pioneers with regards to shifting their, in reality, this goes against everything that these doctors have been taught and all of the degrees and all of the masters that they've completed. For them to actually kind of be receptive to explore it is quite a big thing.
It's massive.
So initial panel of doctors all had been prescribing between sort of 12 months and 2 years.
Sure.
We're now at the point whereby we are mindful of the fact that there are estimated 100 prescribing doctors, so doctors that prescribe cannabis currently, out of a pool of 40,000 who could prescribe. And clearly, if the market is to get to 350,000 patients, which is where we're expecting it to get to, MAMEDICA are expecting it to get to by sort of 2026, if you extrapolate 10% a month from 2019, we're going to need a lot more doctors to be able to facilitate the onboarding of all of those patients, because 100 doctors, even if they're working full-time, wouldn't be able to handle anywhere near the capacity. So we have this month 2 neurology consultants, 1 psychiatry consultant, and 1 pain consultant coming on board who have not prescribed medical cannabis before.
Fantastic.
They've been on an onboarding program with us for the course of the last month or so.
Sure.
That involves sitting in on our MDTs, multidisciplinary team review, which takes place every day after our clinical sessions to approve all the prescriptions that our doctors are proposing to write. And they've also been shadowing our consultants during live consultations with patients. We've obviously had to get consent from the patient to allow another consultant to be able to sit there. But we've been doing that over the course of the last month as well, so that we're preparing the doctors who haven't prescribed before for what potentially could come up in their specialisation with a patient for a consultation for medical cannabis.
That's so exciting, though, just to hear that you've got, I mean, the 4 new consultants in a month is, I think that's unprecedented. I don't think I've heard anyone on board 4 in a month before. I mean, it must be like buses where you wait and 4 come along at once. But I mean, you mentioned as well the 115 doctors or whatever it is prescribing out of the 40,000. It just shows how important these individuals are. And to hear new doctors coming into the space is always, something that should be celebrated, because they are taking a risk. I think that's something often people don't understand, is the responsibility for the prescription is almost entirely with that doctor, in terms of the responsibility for what has been prescribed, not necessarily delivering it and the rest, but actually the products itself and the medical applications. And that you're right, they're guided away from doing this.
Absolutely.
by the regulators.
There's definitely a perceived reputational risk for these doctors, or that they think that there's a reputational risk in that a large proportion of their peers are still not receptive that this is
Yeah.
a very viable treatment option. So I think that some potentially are risk averse with regards to putting their name out there alongside this nascent category for want of not jeopardizing their role, whether it be in private practice, NHS, or a combination of the two elsewhere. And that I understand. And it will take more patients coming out and telling their story and appearing in, mainstream press, highbrow conservative publications for maybe these doctors to start taking notice.
I was going to ask, what was, if you know the answer, what was it that led these new doctors to get involved and commit to start prescribing? What was it that tipped them over that edge and encouraged them to take that risk?
Well, look,
apart from the financial side of things.
But I think you have to pique someone's interest actually before the financial side. As we talked about
it's not
before.
enough. The financial side is that the risk they could earn as much, if not more, on the NHS and other private clinics. So
absolutely. I think that, as we talked about before, the doctors, by virtue of their profession, have a caring side. Their prerogative is to help the patient. Their first thought is not how much money I'm going to make, unlike working in financial markets. So I think you have to pique their interest elsewhere. And I think it helped that we have been able to, via our PR firm, who've been tremendous, get into a number of different publications, put forward patient stories, because that ultimately is what people need to hear about, and alongside have some comment from a specialist doctor. And I think when you present all of that, it's very difficult for any publication to write a negative story about the service, because when you have the patient saying it's changed my life, I don't know how you would go against that.
Tell them they're wrong.
Or how could you write against that? So I think that now when we're approaching doctors and saying, hey, we're MAMEDICA, we're regulated, prescribing for 10 months, you can access our websites here, and here are all the articles that we've been featured in, it gives it that much more credibility, which possibly wouldn't have been there if we were approaching doctors who hadn't prescribed before back in end of 2021, beginning of 2022.
And you've been particularly successful with those media, those articles that you've been managed to get out there. I've seen others in the space doing it, other clinics doing it, but I think, when was the first one? You must have had one in September last year. I think they've been been pretty consistent in reeling these out, haven't you?
So our first one was actually in August.
Sure.
August last year.
Sure.
So it was probably a couple of months after we launched. We got a feature in the Metro where they linked to our website.
Wow.
There were 2 patient stories, 2 different age demographics, which is great because, you have to,
you've got to show the breadth
absolutely.
The patients that we see, sure.
We treat a very wide range of conditions, and as a result of such a wide range of conditions, there is quite a wide age demographic as well. So Metro was our first one, and I don't know whether it's skill or luck. They say you make your own luck, or it's better to be lucky than good. But with our marketing team's help, we decided on a firm which has been just absolutely unbelievable. In the first sort of month that we appointed them as our PR firm, I was pretty much doing interviews with mainstream press every other day. We were putting forward patients, doctors, and probably the work that we put in, probably December, January, possibly even into a little bit of February, is what you've seen over the course of the last few months, and that's why the concentration was so big, because there was quite a lot of behind the scenes work going on to enable us to get to that point.
Yeah, I don't think people always understand quite how much work that is to get those stories out there, to get doctors' quotes signed off, and make sure patients are happy with any testimonials.
Well, the doctors are slightly easier because obviously they're part of MAMEDICA.
By this point, they've committed and they're happy to talk about it.
And if we organise it in their clinical session and they don't have a consultation, we just kind of slide it in anyway, and they're very happy to talk about what they're doing, because they're genuinely one of the pieces of feedback which I was getting when we first looked for the doctors, if we rewind a little bit, is that the job satisfaction that we're getting from prescribing cannabinoids versus opioids or antidepressants or whatever else is being dished out to people who are suffering is a different world. The feedback they were receiving is a different world to what the feedback they were getting from the other traditional meds, which is actually pretty poor efficacy. So we've got a few really exciting pieces coming up.
Great.
That we've been working on, and please God, we can continue to get patients to agree to share their story. Because unfortunately, without the patients,
part of it, right?
Without the patients agreeing to kind of stick their head above the parapet, is that the phrase?
Yep.
Potentially, the journalists wouldn't be interested. Potentially, then they could write a story which has negative connotations, much like a lot of the stories that have kind of been written in the preceding 4 years.
Oh yeah, decades, yeah.
Or decades, decades exactly.
Just about cannabis in general.
So really, big credit to the patients who've agreed to do this with us. Without them.
So it's all down to them. And it's interesting because it's the world that I come from. As if there's anything that I've done in my career, it's putting my head above the parapet time and time again, and going back some way now. But and in my view, it really is. I mean, you need the doctors, you need people like yourself to be organising these things and putting these companies together in a way that works and is functional. But every major progression we've had in this space has come from patients standing up and telling their story, and it's almost cynical in a way, where as an industry we're somewhat reliant on them taking that risk, because it is a risk, I think.
Yep. I definitely think that there are some patients that we have from a certain socio-economic or certain background, ethnic background, who absolutely would not share their story.
Would never do it.
So we had BBC Asia News Network.
Sure.
I think that was it.
Yeah.
The channel, something. I might have the words slightly incorrect, but they were asking for a patient which came from a specific demographic.
Sure.
And we have patients clearly who are of that ethnicity. We have patients who are from all ethnicities, but we couldn't get a patient to agree to even go on radio to talk about medical cannabis, because they felt that even though it was benefiting them so greatly, it would be frowned upon amongst their family, their friends, colleagues, whatever the case may be.
It brings me on to the next point, which is, and something I'm going to, the viewers watching and everyone who follows my stuff will be sick of me saying it, but the two things that we need in this space, and two things that patients need and the industry needs, is awareness is one, and we've talked a bit about that. We talked about getting in the media and obviously, but it's acceptance too. And I think even with a legal prescription, no law breaking happening, nothing to do with illegal cannabis, pharmaceutically regulated medicines, doctors, prescriptions, the lot, there's still a huge amount of judgment and stigma that happens at a sort of social level, whether it's family, friends, colleagues, bosses. And what I'm seeing more and more, I'm sure you're seeing it too, is patients are having these confrontations now. They're not having confrontations with the police, where the police are, I mean, they do sometimes have confrontations with police, and it has to, they show their prescription, hopefully they're let on their way, but with bosses, with family members, where people are judgmental, despite the fact that it's legal, despite the fact it's prescribed, and they're just sort of following doctor's orders. How do you manage that as a clinic? Do you get a lot of, how does that work?
So
difficult question.
We have had some requests from patients to write letters
for
them to employers,
Yep.
to venues that they're attending,
Yep.
for court cases where potentially someone is using the fact that that they have a legal prescription and are using cannabis against them. So, you know, we as a clinic will do everything that we can within reason to be able to facilitate our patients having as easiest time as possible being a patient, because we don't believe it should be any different.
Yeah, yeah.
But that being said, there are still instances where patients are encountering situations whereby whoever it is that they're having the
dispute
dialogue with
Sure.
just is completely unaware
Yeah.
of the legislation, and it's more likely to be an employer as opposed to law enforcement, because like you said, if police officer
After
rings
so many
around enough
stops of people consuming cannabis, they're going to have worked that out.
absolutely. And in actual fact, what started to happen is they started to call us, police forces around the country, albeit some are legal patients, some are not. Probably the ones that aren't, that are naming us instantly as a result of our marketing. So we have had some instances where
people who are using illegal cannabis are saying, no, it's from MAMEDICA.
Yeah. It's not funny.
That's not helpful.
It's not funny.
I'm laughing because
it's not funny because people shouldn't be doing it. But on the other hand, it shows that
word is getting out.
Word is getting out. So we had a police officer call here actually a couple of weeks ago, and he stopped a chap in a courtroom. So it must have been magistrate's court or Crown Court or wherever. You know, I've never been to court. So I don't.
Good to know.
You know what I mean. So he basically said, "I've stopped this chap. He's got a tub of flour," and when I asked him why has he got that, his response was instantaneous, that he was a patient of MAMEDICA. So the police officer said, "I thought I'd give you a call just to double check." So he gave the name, date of birth. We checked the system, and obviously our heart sank when we couldn't find the name. We tried a few permutations, and we had to say, "Look, we're really sorry. It wouldn't be right. We would never say. We can't do that."
Also, if you did that and word got out that you did that, God, everyone would be
absolutely
walking around their illegal cannabis claiming it was yours.
Our phones would be even busier than they are now. So, look, again, there have been other instances where they call us up, we verify it. Yes, absolutely. And one of the other things that we do is travel letters. Yeah. So if you're traveling within Europe or to a country which doesn't have, death by hanging if you're caught with, cannabis.
That's Singapore, isn't it? Just a
shame. Yes, but actually the laws, believe it or not, in a lot of those Asian countries is changing.
Yes, the attitudes yes.
Yeah, my mum's actually from Malaysia, which is traditionally, not traditionally, it is a Muslim country. It has predominantly Muslim Malaysians, and then it has Southern Chinese which emigrated. Yeah. But in a country like that, if you ever caught with any type of drug, you're going to have serious ramifications. And in actual fact, Malaysia changed legislation to allow cannabis for medicinal purposes. Thailand has obviously gone recreational recently.
Jumped the whole hog.
The UAE, Dubai, not Christmas just gone. Christmas before that put out a statement saying that they would no longer be putting international tourists caught with THC into prison. They would get a warning and potentially be deported. Oh. So there is a sea change happening.
It's good to hear.
But
it's surprising, isn't it, where you can and can't travel? I always think that you can't, the US is one of the places where you can't.
Yeah. I mean,
which seems completely counterintuitive.
I mean, they will not let anything in
or out. Which was part of the problem, presumably, with those cartridge vaporizers we were talking about earlier.
Absolutely. But I mean, we've even had requests for letters to go to places like Egypt and Turkey, and when we see the request, we're obviously a little bit skeptical, shall we say, about whether or not customs would actually accept something like this. Yeah. But as we always advise everyone who asks us about this type of thing, the recommendation is to go to the government website for the destination country, check whether or not they would allow you to bring a prescription in of this type, and if so, what documentation is it that they require, and we will always do our best to ensure that we furnish a patient with the letter in advance of them travelling, so that got best possible chance of having the medication that they need with them.
It's so interesting that and it's a testament to how far we still got to go, perhaps, that you're setting up a clinical service, and the patient see the doctor, that's fine, patient gets the prescription, that's fine, it's delivered, the patient's consuming it, all fine. And then there's another step for you guys after that, which is just managing societal attitudes and the sort of progressive regulatory change on an international level in this particular instance in terms of traveling, but also localized here. And you mentioned, court cases. That's when I see now and again, always around, well, not always, but almost always around custody battles, which is, it's incredible to me to think that you have people using illegal cannabis, and obviously that's an issue for someone who's a parent. If they're in that situation, they just have to go get a prescription, and that is nullified. That's no longer an issue for them that can be brought up in court. They're doing exactly what a doctor tells them to do. And I just think that's because I personally spoke to a lot of people before it was legalized who were in those positions and were obviously distraught about not being able to have access to their kids, and the choice being no longer use this substance that's helping you and keeping you pain-free, or see your children, and having to think about that as a choice. And I think more often than not, they obviously chose the children, I think, wherever that was possible. But to be in a position where we can help people with that and resolve that in a way that works for all parties involved, it's a wonderful thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think if someone's genuinely using it for a medical condition, look, it's inevitable that if you get into a custody battle or you're in a divorce proceeding, the other party is going to try and use whatever it is that they can via a lawyer, more often than not, to get the upper hand. Yeah. So, especially when there's children involved, you start mentioning drugs, and if the other party does not have a legal prescription, you immediately are in a better position. So you're absolutely right. All of the letters that we get that are requested for court cases, etc., are generally for custody battles, divorces, etc.
Seems to be that more often than not.
Yeah, which is a shame, really. But like you said, at least we're starting to be able to do something for people who are being wronged by our legislative system, I guess.
Yeah, exactly that, or have been in the past and are now, untangling that complexity. And, yeah. It's a really interesting time, isn't it? In that sense, with that sort of normalization, and the more more you get these articles out in the paper, the more patients come to you, the more they're going to have these confrontations. And I guess as an industry, we it's our job, I suppose, to ensure that the things are resolving in the best possible way.
Yeah, and look, at the end of the day, they might not come to us. We're not the cheapest, but we provide what we think is the best quality service. Just like if you're traveling on airlines, you can fly EasyJet or Ryanair if you like, or you can go and fly Emirates. So what I would say is that even if we are not getting the patient to come and use our service, if a patient has found out about medical cannabis via our efforts and then goes and joins another clinic because it's a price point which is more suited to them, then so be it. We've actually done our job. We're trying to create awareness. We're going to try and create education. It may well be that patient doesn't have a good experience with that clinic and in the end ends up with us anyway, right? But what I would say that is, whether we're doing the work, creating the awareness and the education, whether you're doing it or whether one of our competitors is doing it, it's of benefit to us all. Yeah. We all need to do well in order for this alternative medicine to be what it should be and has become in other more developed countries, like Germany, if we're talking about somewhere very close to home.
Yeah, Germany is a great example. Yeah, I think the rising tide lifts all ships is a phrase that has been said to me in the context of the cannabis industry, I think, for years now, and it's true. It's absolutely true, and we can be, I think there's a detriment to being too aggressively competitive within what is still quite a small and niche space. So it's great. It's great to hear that sort of attitude, and I think you're entirely right to have that stance. And something I talk to patients a lot about is, there's affordability, and if you can't afford it, you can't afford it, and that's a problem. And hopefully NHS access and other things later down the line will help with that. Those at the very bottom end of that ladder. But what I want to reiterate, I suppose, often is value for money, and it sounds like you guys are providing that. It sounds like that's the key here, is not to rip people off or to provide a cheap service. The key is that people are coming to you with certain expectations that you're fulfilling them.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the service, the fees that we charge are reflective of the service and the personnel that we need to be able to keep that high level.
Yeah.
If we were to reduce our fees and not have the right resources, i.e. we don't have the funding to have the right resources to provide the service, then full well that the patient's going to feel that they don't feel like they're being treated like a patient.
Yeah.
They very quickly get a sense that something's not quite right, or a lot of these patients are anxious. They're stressed already. They've had to deal with the NHS, which has for various reasons is underserving a lot of people in the country at the moment. There's a lot of people who are doing a tremendous job within the NHS,
of course.
But the actual organisation itself is not able to be as nimble or to provide the type of service that we are, because we're much smaller in the scale and the variety of different things that we do. But a lot of these patients have been mistreated previously. So the first inkling that they get that they're not getting the service that they were promised, they're going to go and transition and go elsewhere.
Yeah. That anxiety is going to ring.
Absolutely. We're not trying to make people more anxious. We're not trying to exacerbate their condition.
Treat anxiety.
We're trying to make it better.
Inevitably, if it's not the symptom you're treating, a secondary symptom of what you're trying to treat. Inevitably.
And like we talked about before, that was kind of my catalyst.
Yes.
It was my old colleague telling me, I've got stress, I've got anxiety, I'm using this clinic and it's making it worse. So that would be the last thing that we wanted to do.
Yes, it's one of the things I talk to patients about a lot, I think, and it's that you can charge a large amount or a small amount, but really it's about value for money. It's about providing something where a patient doesn't feel ripped off, it's super expensive or so cheap that they're not getting what they need out of the service. So that's such an important thing, to be providing value, not necessarily the cheapest service, I think is the point.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that in most situations in life, you're not going to go for the cheapest thing. You're going to want to get value for money. So you might be a little bit more expensive, but you're getting a bit more. And I don't think that if you're talking about your health, you should always be going for the cheapest option, because you only live once, and maybe if you got slightly better care for whatever your condition was, you might have a better end result. The conversation has been very prevalent. The conversation about affordability, accessibility has been very prevalent since we started. I mean, if you look through our Instagram comments, it is inundated with questions, comments that we have to kind of reply to and justify and explain why we're priced as we're priced. Yeah.
It's because we're a nation that uses the NHS.
Yes.
Generally speaking, people aren't used to private medicine, and
absolutely. Inherently, it's a different culture to what our service, to the way that our service is being administered. That being said, taking on board all the comments on Instagram and everywhere else, we did take your lead and also launch our own access scheme earlier this year for patients that are on means-based benefits.
Sure.
And our veterans or our veterans, which significantly reduces the cost of consultations. So much so that there is only ever a one-off fee for our clinic services of £200.
Sure.
Which gives patient full access to our doctors, GPs, pharmacists. So this would be for all consultations, an issue of repeat prescriptions for as long as they are a patient of ours, so that they don't have that burden of having to worry about paying for the consultations to remain within the service so that they get their medication.
Yeah.
And the access scheme patients enjoy the same level of service as a regular paying patient. And there's no difference there. It's not like when you get onto a British Airways flight. And,
it's not economy in first class.
Exactly. It's not quite like that.
You're getting a served a 3-course meal and then something in a Tupperware.
When patient calls us up and we bring their details up, there is no differentiation there as to whether or not you are paying for your follow-up consultations or whether or not you're an access scheme patient. And I think that it's been received well, and people have made recommendations to our access scheme for that reason. We're a little bit different to the Grow Access scheme in that we're not a manufacturer of the product. So I think where you provide benefit is that you're able to discount the product for patients that are
it's the same groups as
receiving your product.
Yeah.
So I think if someone was receiving average prescription size, they would probably save somewhere around £360 per year were they to access your product via your scheme. I think if you're taking roughly
compared to 30, someone off,
30 grams a month, let's just say.
Sure.
Whereas with us, you are saving £250 in the first year, and £75 every year you're a patient of ours thereafter.
Sure.
So we're both offering better affordability, just in a different way.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think probably the USP of our access scheme is that we don't just have grow products, we have the whole range of every medication available in the UK. So it just gives our patients comfort in the knowledge that they don't have to keep moving around clinics to get access to updated or the latest products.
Or the latest prices.
Exactly. You
have to be careful with those access schemes with that, I think, where how are you, for want of a better word, sort of pushing patients or funneling patients with how you price things. And I think that it's clever what you've done. I think it makes a lot of sense.
Don't get me wrong, there are some products which we're probably not making money on. But like I said to you, right at this point in time, that's not our focus.
No.
We know as we build up our patient numbers and we order more products and in higher volume, those margins will improve, even the ones where we're not making as much as we would like to. Maybe we could actually buy it wholesale at some point, which then would allow us to negotiate a better margin. But right at this point in time, it's just about giving the widest choice available, because I think that's where there had been restrictions in the past. I think that's one of the reasons why patients were disgruntled.
Yes.
And it's also one of the reasons why medical cannabis in the UK was not being recommended as much as it is now.
Yeah.
So what I mean by that is a patient who is enjoying benefit from a service like ours going to tell their friend who is also suffering from the same or another condition that they can come and access our service is the best form of marketing you could possibly do, and it's free. Yeah. All we need to do is live up to what we say that we're going to deliver.
Absolutely. Well, but perfectly put, and I think that rounds this off really nicely. It's been absolutely lovely to chat about MAMEDICA and get to know you guys a little better.
Thank you for talking to us about MAMEDICA. It's been a pleasure.
And thanks for having us here in this wonderful setting. We'll certainly be back, and we'll come interview again in a year's time.
Fantastic. Or maybe we'll have to come to your setting next time.
Come to us, yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much, Jon, and thank you very much.
Absolute pleasure.
And thanks everyone for watching. We'll be back with another episode very soon. It's been great conversations. See you soon.